22 Purdue graduates have gone on to become astronauts, including the first and last man to walk on the moon. Hi, I'm Randy Roberts, and welcome to the Boilermakers. The astronaut tradition at Purdue began with a 1950 graduate who had a passion for flying. The irrepressible Virgil I. Gus Grissom, the second American in space, the first Purdue astronaut, and the subject of this edition of the Boilermakers. They were just a few weeks away from a launch that would send them into Earth orbit for 14 days. Led by Purdue graduate Gus Grissom, the three-man crew suited up for a series of tests in the spacecraft.
41-year-old Gus was a seasoned veteran of the group.
One of the last original Mercury 7 astronauts in the program. He was the first man to fly in space twice, and the trusted veteran NASA chose to command the first Apollo flight. The Apollo program set out to finally achieve the monumental goal President Kennedy established 6 years earlier, to send a man to the moon and return him safely by decade's end. It was January 27, 1967, and Gus Grissom, NASA, and all of America were on the verge of doing something that was thought to be, for centuries, pure science fiction.
Presenting the amazing interplanetary adventures of Flash Gordon.
Comic strips and sci-fi radio serials captured young Gus's imagination. He flew his balsa wood model airplane out in the front yard, acting out the latest space adventures of Buck Rogers and Flash Gordon. He wanted to fly, but growing up in the Depression in a small Indiana town, becoming a pilot seemed as likely as, well, going to the moon. Gus was born Virgil Ivan Grissom on April 3, 1926, the oldest of 4 children to Dennis and Cecilia Grissom.
My dad worked on the B&O Railroad for 47 years. Fortunately, Dad had a job all during the Depression, and my folks didn't have a lot of means, but they were very sharing people, and they helped a lot of people out that didn't have very much back in those days. My mother was one of these people that if you walked in her front door, she thought you must be hungry.
Dennis and Cecilia raised their 4 children in Mitchell, Indiana, a hard-working town of 3,000 in the southern part of the state, known for the railroad, limestone quarries, and the Carpenters Body Works school bus factory. Growing up, Gus was an adventurous spirit who was a doer and not a talker. The Grissoms encouraged their eldest son's active nature, and it was one family trip that made a particular impression on Gus.
Well, according to his father, it was one summer day they took a ride out to Vincennes, and Gus had his first ride in an airplane. Gus later said that he made his share of model airplanes when he was a kid growing up, but didn't consider himself to be a flying fanatic. That might have changed after that first experience in the air, because later family legend has it that he traded an air rifle for another airplane flight.
His enthusiasm for flying didn't quite cross over into the classroom. In high school, he enjoyed math and science, but he never distinguished himself as a standout student.
I guess you'd rank him as a fair student. The issue comes up, was he putting forth all the effort he could in those years? Why, the answer probably no.
When he was in high school, he wasn't that big. You know, he was only around 100 pounds and about 5'4", and he wasn't an athlete from the standpoint of playing basketball or football, but he was very competitive. He was quite an individual, an extreme amount of charisma that just always shined through.
Betty Moore became acquainted with Gus's charm at a high school basketball game. She was a year younger and a drummer in the band. At halftime, Gus made his way over to where she was sitting and sat down beside her on the bleacher.
Lore has it that they, took one look at each other and knew that they were made for one another, and dated throughout high school. And there was always an understanding, although Gus never really got down on his knee and formally proposed, that they would be married.
In 1944, as Gus finished up his senior year, World War II was raging. He was eager to enlist and saw it as an opportunity not only to serve his country, but to train as a pilot. Gus was ordered to report to duty on August 8, 1944, as an air cadet in the U.S. Army Air Corps.
And I said, "What'd you do out there?" And he said, "Well, they had so many of them, they didn't know what to do with. So they transferred him to, I believe, Boca Raton, Florida, and made a clerk typist out of it."
11 months into his service, he made a quick trip back to Mitchell to marry his high school sweetheart, Betty. They exchanged vows on July 6, 1945. A month later, the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, and Japan soon surrendered, ending the war. Gus was discharged without seeing any action or the inside of a cockpit. The dream of flying looked like it would remain just that, a dream. Besides, he had responsibilities now. He was a newlywed with a wife to support, and he returned to Mitchell to find a job and start a new life. He was 19 years old.
Gus got a job at the Carpenter bus factory putting doors on school buses, but was not very happy with that.
He had that drive to do something more with his life, and not that it was a bad job, it just wasn't of his interest. He just had higher aspirations than that.
Gus's growing frustration was putting a strain on the young marriage. So Betty was somewhat relieved when Gus asked her one morning what she thought of him enrolling at Purdue University. She was all for it.
And he had these partial benefits from the GI Bill. It was a little iffy at first if he'd be accepted at Purdue because his grades weren't the best in high school. As he said, I was kind of drifting, didn't know what I wanted to do.
Kind of interesting, the high school superintendent did not endorse his recommendation to go to Purdue.
But because of his status as a veteran and a personal interview, he did get accepted to Purdue University. And when he went there, of course, Purdue was experiencing an explosion of students after the war, like a lot of colleges and universities were across the country. There was an influx of returning servicemen who wanted to get on with their lives, had the support of the GI Bill to further their education.
Gus knew that he was lucky to get into Purdue, and unlike high school, he became very academically focused. He had shown an aptitude in math and was determined that a degree in mechanical engineering would provide him with a suitable career to support his family. With only partial benefits from the GI Bill, Gus flipped burgers on nights and weekends, and when Betty joined him during his second semester, she took a job as a telephone operator. They scraped by and saw little of each other. During those rare occasions when they were together, they'd take in a Purdue football game or play cards. It was during a card game that the man known as Virgil Grissom would be changed forever.
They had a scorecard where he had abbreviated his last name as Gris, and someone read that upside down as Gus and started calling him Gus, and the nickname stuck, and he went by that for most of his life.
Gus graduated from Purdue a semester early in February 1950. Armed with a degree in mechanical engineering, he faced the job market flooded with new college graduates and a nagging desire that just wouldn't go away.
After he graduated, he half-heartedly looked for a job. His specialty was in heating and air conditioning, and I remember him going on 2 or 3 interviews, but I don't think his heart was really in that. I think that he knew all along that he was going to go back in the Air Force because he wanted to fly.
It was the dawn of the Cold War, and the U.S. was convinced that to stop the spread of communism, they needed to strengthen the military forces, especially air power. The Air Force became a separate military branch in September of 1947. Gus signed up and went off to basic flight training in Texas to finally realize his dream, which almost turned into a nightmare.
He had some problems with landings. He didn't get the aircraft in the proper attitude. for landing, thinking maybe even he was going to be washed out of flight school. And they said, "Memo, you can always be a navigator." Well, he didn't want to be a navigator, he wanted to be a pilot. And he went up with a senior instructor, and he was having trouble again, and he pointed out an instrument on the aircraft panel that Gus had not known about that gave him a clue in how to set up the airplane for the proper landing. And once he did know about that, he did his landing successfully and became a certified pilot.
From then on, you couldn't keep Gus out of the air. Building up his hours and proficiency, graduating from a T-6 trainer to a jet fighter. It wasn't long before his fighter pilot skills were tested in combat. In 1950, communism was on the move, and Gus was ordered to Korea.
Gus flew F-86 Sabrejet fighters against opponents in the MiG-15 aircraft. There was a mission he was involved with, flying cover for a photo reconnaissance plane that came under attack from MiG fighters, and Gus, through his flying, was able to scatter those MiGs attack on the reconnaissance plane, and for that he received the Distinguished Flying Cross. In fact, after he completed his 100 combat missions, which meant a ticket back home to the United States, Gus wanted to stay and fly more missions.
His request was denied. He was promoted to first lieutenant and assigned to a base in Texas as a flight instructor. As Gus continued to rise in the ranks, his family continued to grow. Scott was born in 1950, followed by Mark in 1953.
My father was always very interested in the kids, and so we were always going to the baseball game or hunting or fishing or water skiing, snow skiing. We went and did something.
A typical military family, they moved around the country, base to base, following Gus's advancing career. He took his job seriously and was very good at it, but he wasn't above having a little fun every now and then.
He used to buzz the town of Mitchell, and you'd be lying there in bed some Sunday morning fairly early, and all at once there'd be this big roar. And it just scared the daylights out of you because you didn't know what it was. And it was Gus buzzing the town of Mitchell, and some of the townspeople didn't appreciate it too much, but it was kind of fun.
In 1956, Gus was selected to attend test pilot school at Edwards Air Force Base in California. From the day he enlisted, Gus wanted to be a test pilot. They were the elite flyers on the forefront of aviation technology, testing out the next generation of fighter jets. It was the risk and the challenge of being a test pilot that appealed to Gus's adventurous spirit, but it held less appeal for Betty. During the 1950s, test pilot deaths averaged 1 a week.
These were aircraft with a lot of bugs in them that needed to be tested out. If you were the wife of a pilot, you never knew from day to day whether the man you loved would walk through the door that evening. It was that dangerous of a business.
Much to Betty's delight, Gus walked through the door every night for a year and graduated from test pilot school in May 1957. In just 10 years, Gus had gone from putting doors on school buses to being one of the best jet jockeys in the military. But Gus's journey was only beginning.
Today, a new moon is in the sky, a 23-inch metal sphere placed in
On
orbit
October
by a
4th, 1957, the Soviet Union stunned the world by launching Sputnik, the first artificial satellite to orbit the Earth.
It's hard to imagine what kind of a shock reverberated throughout the country with this news. Here was this country, you know, our foe, the communists, actually putting something over technology-wise on the United States. Here was a country that couldn't build a tractor, and yet they had, you know, leaped ahead of the United States in the race to get into space.
In the midst of the Cold War, the United States was determined not to let the Russians control space. In July of 1958, President Eisenhower signed into law the National Aeronautics and Space Act, which created the civilian space agency, NASA. With the Russians claiming victory with the first satellite, the next race for space superiority would involve sending a man into space. Initially, the newly created civilian space agency, NASA, was going to have an open application process for the occupation listed as astronaut.
President Eisenhower wanted the selection process to be kept secret,
and only military test pilots that met certain criteria would be considered.
You had to be under 40 years old, you had to have a degree from an accredited college, had to be less than 5 feet 11 inches tall, you had to be a qualified pilot, and also have at least 1,500 hours of time in the air to become an astronaut.
508 military test pilots met the criteria, and one of those pilots was 5'7", 32-year-old Purdue graduate Gus Grissom.
Well, Gus was at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base when one of the adjutants on duty said, you know, Gus, what kind of hell have you been raising lately? Because he had received secret orders to report for Washington, D.C. And Gus was wondered, you know, maybe he was in trouble because he didn't salute some general or something.
Far from a reprimand, Gus discovered that he was one of 100 astronaut candidates invited to interview at NASA.
He told us he was going to Washington to be considered for this program called Project Mercury. And, you know, that didn't mean anything to us, but, and when he started talking about going into space and all of that sort of thing, it just seemed like this is something out of this world.
After making it through the first round in Washington, Gus and 31 other test pilots endured 7 days worth of rigorous testing at the Lovelace Clinic in New Mexico. No one knew how difficult space flight would be, so the doctors exposed the men to a thorough battery of evasive tests that pushed the men's physical and mental well-being to the limit. The 32 were cut to 18 finalists, and out of those, 7 men were selected. On April 9, 1959, NASA held a news conference to introduce to the public America's first 7 astronauts, the Mercury 7. Bill Head and his wife knew that Gus would be in the running and were pretty confident that their high school classmate would be one of the 7.
Me and her gathered around the TV because we said, we know who one of them's going to be. And they started naming them off, and when his name come up, we said, we knew it long before the public did. We were sure, we were just sure, because that was him. Anything new or had something to do with flying, you could bet your life he was going to bid on it.
Joining Gus in the Mercury program were Deke Slayton and Gordo Cooper from the Air Force, Malcolm Scott Carpenter, Alan B. Shepard, and Wally Schirra from the Navy, and John Glenn from the Marines.
When the astronauts were introduced, these cynical, hard-bitten reporters actually stood up and gave them a standing ovation, which was unprecedented at the time. And there was just a media firestorm. They were inundated with questions by the media, a lot having to do with their personal lives, how their families felt about them being selected for the space program.
Well, my wife feels the same way, or of course I couldn't be here. She's with me all the way, and the boys are too little to realize what's going on yet, but I'm sure they'd feel the same way.
My dad was very enthused about it. He thought it was just the greatest thing that could happen. And my mother was not so enthused at all. She just didn't understand all this, and of course was very concerned about re-entering the atmosphere and things burning up, and you know, on and on. And there was so many unknowns at that time.
But what was immediately known was the press's and the public's insatiable appetite to know these 7 men. Life magazine paid $500,000 to obtain exclusive story rights to the astronauts and their families. Career servicemen living a quiet, anonymous existence in the military were now internationally known celebrities.
You know, the fact that it was almost like instant stardom was just amazing. And I think it stunned those 7 Mercury astronauts, and the families were also taken back by it.
Everyone wanted to get a soundbite from one of the original 7 astronauts. And Gus was not comfortable in dealing with the press, hadn't been used to it. And so for one of his flights, to try to get away from the media hordes, he'd even don a disguise. He put on a floppy hat and a pair of sunglasses.
The magazine covers, newspaper headlines, and TV cameras became a routine part of life for Gus and the other astronauts, but they all felt uneasy about the lionization. In the public's eyes, the astronauts represented the courageous American spirit, attempting to conquer a new frontier and defeat the Soviets. In the behind-the-scenes political chess match of the Cold War, space was one of the few opportunities where one country could claim a public victory over the other. The Soviet Union was leading the space race, but now the United States was about to change that with this group of men, the Mercury 7. The early days of the Mercury program were marred by technical setbacks and delays. The success rate of launching test rockets was 60%, and the public's confidence with the space program was on the decline. John F. Kennedy summed up the nation's attitude in a 1960 campaign speech when he said, "If man orbits the Earth this year, his name will be Ivan." And he wasn't talking about Virgil Ivan Grissom. Lagging behind in the race, there was no time for rest. Gus and his fellow astronauts logged long hours trying to catch up.
We saw him less and less, and I think my mom kept track, and for a period of time there, we probably seen him between 4 and 5 days a month was all we'd see my dad.
As pilots, the Mercury 7 were very involved in the spacecraft design. Contrary to popular belief, the relationship between the astronauts and the NASA engineers was mostly productive and positive. But some disagreements did occur.
At first, the engineers had called the spacecraft a capsule, which the astronauts didn't like. And even the McDonnell Aircraft Corporation president said, we're not building a pill, we're building a spacecraft. But the engineers did try to get input from the astronauts. I mean, they were all college educated. Many of them had degrees in engineering. They had been used to testing out new procedures on aircraft as test pilots. So they got their input, including trying to have a window on the spacecraft. It seemed a little odd that they would be, the first people in space and not be able to describe, what space was like, and they wouldn't without a window. There was a hatch that was bolted on with 70 bolts, and the astronauts were worried that they couldn't get out in time in an emergency, and asked for an explosive hatch that could be triggered to be blown off in case there was an emergency.
In February 1961, the Life magazine cover revealed to the public the 3 candidates vying to be the first man in space. NASA insiders already knew the flight order. Alan Shepard would be the first, followed by Gus and then John Glenn. But before Shepard could take the maiden voyage, Russia's Yuri Gagarin became the first man in space with a one-orbit flight on April 12, 1961. Again, the United States was left with the disappointment of finishing second. 3 weeks after Gagarin's flight, on May 5th, Alan Shepard became the second man and the first American into space. Inspired by the success of Shepard's flight and desperate to one-up the Russians, President Kennedy charted a new course for NASA.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win.
Shepard's flight lasted 15 minutes and went 115 miles. The moon was 240,000 miles away. Mankind's most ambitious goal was NASA's new objective. But first, they had to successfully repeat a suborbital flight. A mishap would be disastrous for the program and likely end all discussion of the moon. All this pressure rested on the shoulders of Gus Grissom as he prepared for launch in July of 1961.
He was going on board what was called the Liberty Bell 7. Gus said that the spacecraft resembled a bell and decided to name it after the most famous bell, the Liberty Bell. And they even painted a crack on the spacecraft to resemble the Liberty Bell.
In the early morning of Tuesday, July 18th, Gus climbed into Liberty Bell 7. The one-person spacecraft was so cramped that it was said that you didn't ride in it, but you wore it. The Liberty Bell sat 7 stories high above a Mercury Redstone rocket. The nation's eyes turned to Launch Pad 5, waiting for the countdown to begin. Tucked into one of Gus's spacesuit pockets were 2 rolls of dimes, souvenirs from his boys, 11-year-old Scott and 7-year-old Mark. Through his observation window, Gus could see the cloud cover thickening. 10 minutes before launch, flight controllers called for a 5-minute hold. The hold went from 5 minutes to a half an hour, and then, after 4 hours of waiting for the weather to clear, the mission was scrubbed. 3 days later, on July 21st, 1961, at 7:20 a.m., the Mercury Redstone rocket, filled with 18 tons of fuel, launched Liberty Bell 7 and Gus Grissom toward space.
Roger, this is Liberty Bell 7. The clock is operating. Okay, it's a nice ride up to now. All in clear. Roger. Okay, the fuel is go. About 1 1/4 G's. Cabin pressure is just coming off the pitch. The oxygen is go. 26 amps.
The acceleration was smooth until the spacecraft broke through the sound barrier, causing Liberty Bell to vibrate violently. 2 minutes into the flight, Gus was traveling at over 4,000 miles per hour. Gus watched from his window as the sky went from light to dark blue and then dissolved into the blackness of space. At 118 miles above Cape Canaveral, he looked down at a mesmerizing view that only 2 other men had seen, the Earth from space.
I'm trying a yaw maneuver and I'm on the window. It's such a fascinating view out the window, you just can't help but look out that way.
He fired the retro rockets, positioning the spacecraft for re-entry. As Liberty Bell descended back down into the Earth's atmosphere, the G-forces increased rapidly.
G's are building. We're up to 6. There's 9. There's about 10.
The pressure at that force makes speaking and breathing difficult. The spacecraft slowed and the G-forces decreased as it pierced the Earth's atmosphere. The blackness of space faded back to blue sky. At 12,000 feet, the main chute deployed, and Liberty Bell landed safely in the Atlantic Ocean. From launch to splashdown, the 15-minute flight was an unqualified success.
But after splashdown, it seemed that everything that could go wrong did go wrong for Gus.
Gus bobbed up and down in the sealed spacecraft, recording switch positions in his log as he waited for the recovery helicopters to arrive.
So he was sitting there when he heard a dull thud and saw the hatch skip off across the water. And immediately, of course, water started gushing into the spacecraft. Gus said he never moved as fast as he had in his life in getting out of the Liberty Bell, and it immediately began sinking under the waves. The recovery helicopter managed to hook on to Liberty Bell 7 and actually started pulling it out of the water. But unfortunately for the helicopter pilot, he received a warning light on his engine panel that there was going to be an engine failure on his helicopter, and so he had to cut loose the Liberty Bell 7 and it sank to the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. While all this was going on, Gus was treading water and sinking lower and lower under the waves. Waves would break over him. He swallowed a lot of seawater.
He had closed his neck dam on the suit, but he had forgotten to close one of the valves on the bottom of the suit. So he was taking on water, and he said it's getting harder and harder to stay afloat. And he kept waving to the helicopters, and they kept thinking he's okay, and he wasn't.
He was about ready to drown. He was wondering, I'm going to sink below the waves in front of all these people. Fortunately for him, a second helicopter had come by, dropped a horse collar, and he swam hard, got into it, and was winched aboard.
An official inquiry into the hatch self-triggering corroborated Gus's story and found him not to be at fault. But without the major piece of evidence, the spacecraft, the report failed to eliminate doubt for some within NASA and among the test pilot fraternity. A harmless and honest admission to a reporter that he was scared only fueled the speculation that Gus panicked and blew the hatch prematurely.
I was angry about the way it was handled, because knowing Gus, if he said he didn't do it, he didn't do it. I thought it was always a little ridiculous to think that he would panic. Here's a man that had flown 100 combat missions in Korea. He'd just been sitting on a rocket and blasted into space. He'd come through re-entry, And now he's sitting down in the water. You would think this is all over. Would you panic at that point in time? It just never did make any sense to me.
The debate was finally put to rest when Liberty Bell 7 was salvaged from the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean in May 1999. All evidence from the Liberty Bell restoration supported Gus's story that the hatch blew without being triggered. In February of 1962, 7 months after Gus's flight, John Glenn became the first American to orbit the Earth. While the Mercury program continued with 4 more successful flights, Gus had turned his attention to NASA's next program and the design of the 2-man spacecraft. In order to bridge the technological gap between simply sending a man into space to getting a man to the moon, NASA needed to develop several new systems and processes.
They had to test out if an astronaut could last in space for the approximately 500,000-mile trip to the moon and back. Could spacecraft rendezvous with one another? So to test out these various procedures that needed to be done to get to the moon safely, NASA came up with the Gemini program, kind of a middle step. You had the initial steps with the Mercury program. The Gemini would test out the procedures used for going to the moon, and the Apollo program would be the actual moon missions.
Gus was frustrated with the hatch controversy and being blamed by some for losing the spacecraft. He used that disappointment as motivation and was now more determined than ever to set his mark on America's space effort.
This summer, before his Gemini flight, he spent that whole summer in St. Louis working on that Gemini spacecraft with the McDonnell engineers, and had so much input into the design of Gemini that the other astronauts ended up calling it the Gusmobile.
Flight director Deke Slayton chose Gus to command the first Gemini mission, with rookie astronaut John Young serving as pilot.
They were testing out an entirely new spacecraft, and he wanted someone he could depend upon to make sure that everything went right. And Gus had been so involved in the development of the Gemini craft that I think he was the most logical person to be selected for that flight.
Continuing the naming tradition that started in the Mercury program, Gus christened the spacecraft the Molly Brown, after the Broadway hit show The Unsinkable Molly Brown, a jocular reference to the Liberty Bell sinking. NASA was not amused with Gus's sense of humor, and the naming tradition ended with the Molly Brown. On March 23, 1965, Gus Grissom became the first man to go into space twice. The Molly Brown splashed down in the Atlantic near the Grand Turk Islands after a successful 4-hour, 53-minute, 18-orbit flight. 9 more Gemini flights followed, and by the end of 1966, NASA was entering into the final phase in the race to the moon, the Apollo missions. As the Gemini project wrapped up, only 2 of the original Mercury 7 astronauts remain active in the space program, Wally Schirra and Gus. With a brand new spacecraft, flight director Deke Slayton was again looking for experience to lead the 3-man crew in the first Apollo flight. Gus was selected as the commander for the Apollo 1 mission. Ed White and rookie astronaut and Purdue graduate Roger Chaffee filled out the crew. The technological challenges of landing a man on the moon towered over any of NASA's previous achievements. In just 6 years, they'd gone from sending a single man into space for 15 minutes to planning a mission that would last 14 days, involve 3 astronauts, and 2 separate spacecrafts that would have to dock together in flight while orbiting the moon. It was an Everest-size engineering undertaking, and the clock was ticking.
NASA had this goal set by John Kennedy, the former president, of getting a man to the moon and back before the end of the decade. And so there was just this go fever developed that, we had to rush and beat the Russians and get to the moon before they did.
Gus was concerned that the same level of thoroughness that was a hallmark of the Mercury and Gemini programs was being compromised in favor of expediency with Apollo. The development of the new spacecraft was plagued with technical glitches.
He was extremely concerned about Apollo. My folks were down at the Cape 2 weeks before the accident, and he told them that it was designed as a 2-week mission, and he said never go more than 3 orbits. At one point, I guess he had hung a lemon on one of the simulators to express his dissatisfaction with the quality in that spacecraft.
On the afternoon of Friday, January 27, 1967, the Apollo 1 crew, Gus, Roger Chaffee, and Ed White, boarded the spacecraft to participate in a routine test. In order to simulate a real launch environment, they were suited up, the hatch was sealed, and the cabin was filled with 100% oxygen.
And they were undergoing what was called a plugs-out test. This would be to test out that the spacecraft could operate under its own power without any external power source.
The test stretched on for hours, into the late afternoon and the early evening.
And there were problems from the first part of the test. There was a sour odor that pervaded the interior of the spacecraft that Gus likened to sour buttermilk. There were a lot of communication snafus back and forth. They couldn't communicate properly with one another. And Gus said, if we can't talk between a few buildings, how are we going to talk, from the moon back to the Earth?
30 miles of electrical wiring coiled through the interior of the spacecraft. And at 5 seconds before 6:31 p.m., a tiny spark jumped from a wire behind Gus's seat.
And in the pure oxygen atmosphere under pressure, the smallest sparks could turn into a raging inferno in a very brief amount of time.
The intense smokeless fire burned white hot. The flames shot up the spacecraft walls and across the astronauts, feeding on the fabric of the spacesuits, Velcro, styrofoam padding, and anything that was combustible.
Controllers on the ground were aghast to hear from the reports of fire in the spacecraft from the astronauts inside Apollo 1.
Radio transmission cut in and out, and a voice called out, "We're fighting a bad fire, let's get out, open her up." And then the radio went silent. They attempted to open the hatch, but unlike the Mercury and Gemini spacecraft, Apollo was not equipped with an explodable hatch. The cumbersome process would take minutes, and they only had seconds.
Before they could get out, the fire actually burned through their air hoses, and the poisonous gases inside the spacecraft asphyxiated them. So all 3 astronauts were killed as a result of the fire.
Well, it was a tremendous shock. You might have expected that if they were in orbit, but to have that happen on the ground was just unbelievable, and it was just really a shock to think that this could happen like it did.
It was a shock in one sense, and in another sense, he knew the risk. He knew it.
When your father's your own personal hero, that's a crushing blow.
On a bitterly cold day in January 1967, Virgil Ivan Grissom was laid to rest in Arlington National Cemetery.
There was an extensive investigation undertaken by NASA to find out what had gone wrong with the Apollo 1 disaster, and there was a long list of modifications, including a 2-gas system instead of a pure oxygen system on the launching pad. There was a new hatch developed that could be opened in a matter of seconds if there was an emergency on the ground. So all of these changes really resulted in a spacecraft that NASA and the astronauts could depend upon on subsequent missions to the moon and back. In fact, a lot of the NASA officials said that really the fire of the Apollo 1 disaster was somewhat of a blessing in disguise. Of course, they were stunned at losing the 3 astronauts, but if it had happened in space, they would never have realized what had gone wrong, and they couldn't have made the subsequent changes. It also slowed everything down. Go fever was dissipated. Safety became a top priority instead of speed.
After a 21-month delay, the Apollo program continued, and on July 20th, 1969, Purdue graduate Neil Armstrong set foot on the moon. Man-moon decade was accomplished.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
The legacy of Virgil Gus Grissom lives on in the memorials, schools, and military facilities that bear his name. An Air Force base in Indiana, 14 schools across the country, and 3 university buildings, including one at his alma mater, Purdue University. A museum in Indiana's Spring Mill State Park welcomes thousands of visitors every year, celebrating his accomplishments and vital contributions to America's space program. And in his hometown of Mitchell, Indiana, the Gus Grissom Memorial sits on the site of his old elementary school, a few blocks from the front yard where his boyhood dream first took flight.
I'm completely amazed at what he did. You know, he was just shy of being 41 years old when he lost his life. And you look at the amount of things that he had done is staggering. I mean, he'd kind of been in the military twice, you know, got released once, used the GI Bill, went to college, learned how to fly, went to war, went through test pilot school. I mean, it's a staggering amount of things that my father did in less than 41 years. I mean, I can't believe it.
After a successful Gemini flight in 1965, Gus addressed the dangers associated with space travel. He wrote, "If we die, we want people to accept it. We are in a risky business, and we hope that if anything happens to us, it will not delay the program. The conquest of space is worth the risk of life." For the Boilermakers, I'm Randy Roberts.